I love the state of Michigan, both the Upper and Lower Peninsula. I've lived in the Lower Peninsula most of my life. I am fascinated by its history and its ancient prehistory. But I have visited often the Upper Peninsula, and I'm just as fascinated with its history and prehistory. One place that I've only visited once, but I loved it, and I'll never forget it, is Drummond Island. At Drummond Island, I spent the second night of my honeymoon back in the early 80s there. And despite that, it was a really awesome place to visit because it made me feel like, I don't know how to put it, truly in a very rustic, rural place where no, it sounds stupid, but where nobody could touch me or nobody knew where I was. And truly they didn't, because that night that we went to Drummond Island was a horrendously stormy night. They closed down Mackinac Bridge that night, actually. And Kathy and I took the ferry across from Detour to the island and found a place to stay there for the night. The next day was pretty, and the island was just beautiful. But at any rate, I found a travel brochure that I believe is from the 1950s that gives a brief history of Drummond Island, and it does not give an author, but I'd like to share that history with you now. So, following is the history of Drummond Island, Michigan. The Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, called upon the British to give up their outpost at Mackinac. When Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, commander of the detachment, received this news 6 months later, he withdrew in June of 1815 to a nearby island in Lake Huron called Pontaganipi, and it was called that by the Indians. It was promptly renamed Drummond Island for Sir Gordon Drummond, then Lieutenant Governor of Canada and commander of the British forces there. The new site had many advantages. It was near enough to Mackinac for MacDonald to keep in close touch with his Indian allies. It had admirable harbors and an abundance of timber, fish, and game. Most important of all, it commanded strategic detour passage. MacDonald visualized Drummond Island as a second Gibraltar. His superiors, however, failed to share his enthusiasm for his new project. Plans were snared in red tape, which, together with a lack of funds, effectively quashed his dream of a great island fortress to impress the Indians and defend his frontier. In 1822, the International Boundary Commission cruised the Great Lakes with British and American representatives to settle numerous territorial disputes. It had been generally agreed that as they sailed up the center of Lake Erie and Lake Huron, everything on the right would be awarded to England and everything on the left to the United States. As the trip progressed, though, time and their close association in cramped quarters made friends of former enemies, and soon congeniality was the order of the day. A round of toasts to King George and President Monroe marked every gathering. One such occasion, longer and more exuberant than most, was nearing its end as the ship approached Drummond Island. The Americans, however, were alert to opportunity. They contrived to have the ship's course turned north to pass the island and MacDonald's garrison on the left, which incidentally is how False Detour Passage came by its name. As a result, the Commission awarded Drummond Island to the United States. The British refused to take the edict seriously and stayed on in spite of repeated cajoleries and threats by the American government. And by the winter of 1828, patience reached an end and a military expedition was readied to drive the redcoats from the island. MacDonald's garrison had by this time shrunk from an original 400 to 91 men, and its morale had also succumbed to the infection of boredom and soft living. When they heard that the U.S. forces were actually on the move, the British had no taste for a fight and fled in hasty disorder. They reached, I'm going to massacre this name if you will, but they reached Penetanguishene Island on Matchedash Bay in small boats that were so overcrowded they were forced to abandon all their belongings and leave 2 civilian members of the party behind. Only the ruins of their old fort and its surrounding buildings remain today to attest to Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's dream of a Gibraltar in the North American wilderness. After taking possession in 1828, the United States was content to leave Drummond Island largely to its wildlife and occasional Indians and hunters, and it was not until 1910 that commercialization encroached when a lumber company began operations. This enterprise reached its peak in 1923 when 350 were employed and cutting ran as high as 100,000 feet a day. This operation, none too successful for the start, was abandoned in 1925, and 5 years later, most of its property was sold to the Conservation Department of the state of Michigan as a game preserve and wildlife experimental station. Drummond Island thus again became an unspoiled natural paradise, up where the wild begins. Drummond Island in legend. It is only natural that any spot with a bit part in history like Drummond Islands should have produced stories which, though picturesque, are probably more legendary than they are historical. One such concerns a trader who lived near the North Shore during the British occupation. Though wealthy, his mentality had deteriorated with old age until he had to be closely watched to keep him from harmless, childish mischief. One day, however, he was left alone and, so as the tale goes, disappeared into the bushes, carrying his hoard of gold in an old iron kettle, and when he returned he was without his pot of money, and to his dying day nothing would ever induce him to tell where he had hidden it. 'Tis said it has been diligently searched and dug for through the years, but never has it been found. Another deals with two despondent, homesick British soldiers who deserted and started off into the night. When their commanding officer learned of it, he offered a reward for their capture, dead or alive. Indians trailed them through the forest and came upon them building a fire, and while they were bent over, warming themselves on the fire, the Indians pounced and returned triumphantly with severed heads to claim the reward. That much appears reasonably accurate, but there is a tale passed on through the generations that fishermen on cold nights are apt to see a friendly fire on the shore of Drummond Island. Many are said to have turned their boats landward to join the pair of dim figures huddled over its glow, but joy at the prospect of warmth and company has, without exception, turned to horror as they approached. The men by the fire are always said to have been dressed in the blood-red coats of British soldiers and were, of course, headless. Needless to say, no one has ever landed at night, but the more curious and venturesome who have returned by day are invariably reported as finding the freshly charged logs of a fire which had burned on the spot the night before. Drummond Island today, at least today at the time that this brochure was printed, reads, "On Drummond Island today there are some 500 permanent inhabitants, only a very occasional farm in its 120 square miles. For the most part, it belongs to its deer, thicker here than in almost any other area of North America, to its bear, to its countless birds, to the fish in its waters, and to the lovers of the out-of-doors attracted by its unspoiled natural beauty. It is a campers', hunters', and fishermen's paradise, a favorite stopping place for yachtsmen because of its fine harbors, even marine or land airport. Aside from these, however, and the all-steel 10-car ferry which transports visitors from Detour 24 hours a day, 12 months a year, there is little to suggest that the encroachment of civilization on this island has begun. I have other memories of Drummond Island besides just my second night of my honeymoon there. I remember my dad, God rest his soul, back in the mid to late 60s, would gather, I believe, almost yearly with a group of men that he worked with at Chevrolet Transmission in Saginaw, Michigan, and they would go up there on a week-long fishing expedition, always to Drummond Island. And I remember Dad speaking glowingly of it, and I could see why when I actually spent my honeymoon there. It was a paradise in a modern world, and if it were possible, I would love to live there today, but for health reasons, I could not do that. But I hope you've enjoyed this little look at the history of Drummond Island. There's more in this brochure. It was published by the Wayfarers Mart on Drummond Island, and it was a sportsman's headquarters. I don't know if it's still there or not anymore. I guess it wouldn't surprise me. The brochure shows a small illustration of it. And anyways, as I said, my dad enjoyed it, I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed this short history. God bless you, and please come back again.